Hi, my name is Aram Sifuentes. I am an artist and arts educator based in Chicago. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be your visiting artist and scholar. And I really look forward to the conversations that we're going to be having in the next few days. Um, so let me just jump into my presentation. So, my goal as an artist is to disrupt, unsettle, and rupture dominant narratives to assert, demand, and claim space for those who are commonly othered, particularly for immigrants of color. We are never, never other, and especially in these moments of widespread national and international xenophobia and hate, we have to push back on multiple fronts and in as many ways as we can. So, as an artist and arts educator, I'm constantly asked, how can art create change? What is the impact of art in social change? So, over the years, I've been writing notes in an attempt to answer these questions, and I'll intermittently make points throughout the lecture. They are particularly intended to respond to the concerns of artists of color. So, my thoughts on these are constantly ongoing and evolving. And rather than a comprehensive list, it's a constellation of thoughts and realizations. So, through art, music, and writing, we have the power to tell our stories. These stories are often not told, actively forgotten and or suppressed, perverted, distorted, and oversimplified by dominant culture. Through art, we tell our own stories, through our own lived experiences, and truths on our own terms. So I learned to sew when I was 6 years old, and that was the year we moved to the United States from South Korea. My parents came here without knowing what they would do for work. And luckily, someone in this small Korean community in the Central Valley in California hired them to work at their dry cleaning store. So here's my father's hands. He works the machines, cleaning, pressing, spotting, and ironing. And my mom hems and alters clothes. My parents were able to open up their own dry cleaning store, and they still do this work today. Here's my mom's hands. She actually was formerly an artist and still an artist. And she was an arts educator in Korea as well, who ran her own art center in Seoul. So my parents work 12, 13 hours a day at work, 6 days a week, and my mom always brings sewing home with her. They've been doing this for more than 27 years now. So we'd sit in the living room after dinner and watch TV as my mom would work on her alterations. Spending time with my mom meant sitting and sewing with her. So we would all contribute by ripping seams, ripping out bad zippers, sewing on buttons, and mending rips and holes of other people's clothes. This is where I learned to sew. And it is here from the beginning where sewing became political to me and linked to my identity. And I will always see it from this place, inside this living room, sewing with my family to make a living as immigrants in this country. Here in the living room, I started to collect my mom's jean cuff remnants, right? She's always sewing jeans, right? Since they're so long and people like me are short, right? And so whenever she's working, there's sort of a pile of jean cuffs that just naturally happen to accumulate right next to her, right? So in Chicago, I came here for my MFA in the Fiber and Materials Studies department in 2011. So away from my mother, I wanted to visit those who do the same type of work in Chicago to question what we share and how others came to do this type of work. And I started to visit tailors and seamstresses in Chicago, and these are the scraps. So the lure of the American dream draws many immigrants who arrive who already know or quickly find out that their employment options are limited. Many end up getting jobs that offer low wages, requires repetitive manual labor, and are sometimes hazardous with no union or collective bargaining protections. And these tailors and seamstresses, like my mom, work long and tedious hours and oftentimes takes extra work home or to places where work is unregulated. Immigrants who are granted visas and green cards are usually highly educated and skilled. So why are these nurses, businesswomen, graphic designers, bankers, artists, and teachers finding themselves sewing jeans for $10 to $20 a piece for over 12 hours a day? Some say my parents should be appreciative of the opportunities given to them. I don't see it this way. I see it as an exploitation of immigrants to keep the cost of handwork and manual labor low in this country. So by telling our own stories, we shift the frame and put ourselves in the center. We live in a society where most things are defined by whiteness. When we tell stories and truths from our own perspective, we rupture white narratives and define ourselves and our experiences to ourselves and our communities. So my project, the US Citizenship Test Sampler, asks the question, who should be granted citizenship and how do they prove themselves? So I use the word sampler because samplers were used in colonial America during the 18th and 19th century, where teachers used samplers to teach small children as young as 5 or 6 to embroider numbers and the alphabet, as you can see here. So sewing was a tool actually to learn basic educational concepts. And then some adolescent girls, generally from wealthier families that were able to continue their education, would create a second sampler. And this sampler functioned to show off the values of the girl and her family to her potential suitors, right? So essentially it was sort of showing off how her worth as a wife, right? So if you've ever heard anyone say like, oh, you're really good at sewing, you must be a great wife. Doesn't make sense now, right? But that's where that comes from. So the project, the US Citizenship Test Sampler, riffs off of traditional samplers. So I'm stitching the 100 civics questions and answers of the US naturalization tests. So actually there's 100 of these questions that they require you to study. So in the actual civics part of the test, they pick 10 and you have to get 6 or more right. And it's an oral test. So this embroidery I'm creating is 8.5 inches wide and about 22 or so feet long. And it's on linen and I'm using cotton thread. So I started this project from practical motivations. So when I started, I wasn't a US citizen and I had to learn the test material, right, to pass the test. So the project follows 5 guidelines. So number 1, to sell the sampler for the cost of applying for citizenship. So I sold this in December of 2016 for $680. Now the cost of applying for citizenship has gone up to $725. Number 2, to log my hours of stitching the sampler. So like I said, I sold it at $680 and I was on question 53 and I put in about 300 hours. So I made a little more than $2 per hour. 3, to apply for citizenship only if my sampler sells. So I was making my application for citizenship contingent on the sale of the sampler. So in that way, I was letting others decide if I've proven my worthiness of becoming a citizen. And as I said, with the sale of my sampler, I became a citizen. Number 4, to engage other non-citizens to stitch one of the civics questions and answers. So each of these are 8.5 by 11, also on linen. And lastly, number 5, to exhibit and sell the sampler. So each work is on sale for $725, the cost of applying for citizenship. And the full amount goes to the maker of the sold samplers. So initially, I only asked participants to stitch their question and answer. However, one of my first participants asked if he could add more because he didn't think it would sell for $680. And since then, many sampler makers have been adding pictorial elements of their own choosing and making judgments of their own invested work and time. So currently, there's more than 120 complete samplers. These samplers are exhibited together to display the collective value of this community of non-citizens. So in some instances, I work one-on-one with participants based on the individual and their educational needs to pass the citizenship test. I have become a private tutor for both English and the civics questions, right? Because there's multiple parts of the test, including reading English, speaking English, and then also, like I said, the civics questions. So I've been facilitating these citizenship sewing workshops at nonprofit organizations, community centers, and schools all over the US, where communities of non-citizens come together to learn the citizenship test material through the act of sewing. So the sampler workshops, they organically become these grassroots roundtable discussions addressing immigrant rights, labor politics, and everyday concerns of intergenerational and multi-ethnic people. This workshop I did at the Smithsonian, and Lulia was one of my youngest participants at age 6. So some see the act of non-citizens studying American history and government through a traditional American craft as patriotic, while others interpret this project as politically confrontational, where the act of stitching these samplers by non-citizens represents a confrontation of a text that's inherently condescending of the immigrant community. And of course, like I've talked about, sewing is a gesture linked to the types of work that immigrants currently do. But I think the double reads of this project is really important because the project exists simultaneously as patriotic and as political dissent and critique. But at the core, it subverts a critique of the US immigration and naturalization laws and the vulnerability of immigrants navigating their way through the process. Firstly, the citizenship test is ridiculous, right? So USA News did a study in 2012 that showed that 1 in 3 Americans actually failed the citizenship test. And that's actually, I've seen other studies that actually say 2 in 3 fail, right? And this comes up in every workshop, right? So why do I have to know who the president was during World War I to prove that I'm worthy of citizenship? Or how many members there are in the House of Representatives? Or what year the Constitution was written? What does the rule of law even mean? And as individuals and as a community, we non-citizens do not have the freedom to voice our protests of the conditions put upon us as immigrants without fear of repercussions. So one of the requirements to become a citizen is, word for word, to be of good moral character, right? And we can see this happening in the last 4 years, right? Where the laws protecting immigrants are very precarious, right? And constantly evolving, and really dehumanizing. So this is a political project that deals with the questions of time, labor, work, economy, capitalism, and patriotism. From start to finish, it's about reclaiming the historical act of making samplers. The act of making samplers in it of themselves are about assessing value, the value of the skills of the woman making them. And that assessment of handwork is lost in this industrial age where embroidery and handcrafts are made by so-called invisible laborers. This project aims to reclaim this tradition and reclaim it for the racialized immigrant working class. Immigrants often do not have time or access to make art. So for example, most of the organizations and schools that I do workshops at make it clear that they don't do arts and crafts programs, that each and every workshop needs to fulfill educational components. It's a policy that makes it clear that immigrants are always expected to work to prove ourselves. Why teach immigrants how to do arts and crafts when they need to spend that time to study English, computers, or work toward their citizenship? In this project, I create this space for non-citizens where we stitch, make art together, and make money from our work. By telling our own stories and centering ourselves, we claim space. We become visible. Representation is that I see you, right? I am you. You're not alone, you're important, and we are proud. There's something profoundly powerful about seeing the many nuances and complexities of your story and your experiences reflected back to you. It's a sigh of momentary relief, and then we fight for more. This is one of my favorite ways to use art. to talk back to power, particularly because I work with vulnerable communities, such as non-citizen immigrants. They're people who don't have the freedom and space to talk back to power without fear of repercussion or reprisal. So art can create this space under the guise of creativity. So this project started on November 9th, 2016, following the results of the 2016 presidential election. On that day, protests erupted all over the nation, and I started making banners and started to invite people to make banners with me. At the same time, organizations started to ask me to facilitate banner making workshops for the public. And this is really how the project Purchase Banner Lending Library began. So I say the project has two parts. So the first part of the project are these free public workshops where people can learn how to make their own purchase banners in really simple steps using Fusible Web. So actually no sewing is required. So I have a photo tutorial on the Purchase Banner Facebook page or my website. So your first banner usually takes about an hour and a half to 2 hours to make. This workshop skills sharing component has become really importantly pedagogical. So the workshop in the space they create address people's immediate desires to create banners for themselves and others and to use in protests, but it also places the skill of making purchase banners in the hands of the participants where they have the skills to continue making them for themselves, in their communities, and for their art practices. And of course, when we're talking about revolution, right, we have to keep going. So these workshops have become such an important part of my practice because it is where I feel nourished. I feel immense joy and power when I make art with my communities. And in many non-Euro Western cultures, art is made collectively, not by an individual. So making art together creates spaces for our knowledge, connected through lived experiences, to be shared and uplifted. These spaces of collective making become radical spaces to talk, listen, validate each other, share stories and resources, talk through our differences, right? Learn about ourselves and others, and playfully come up with strategies to live and fight. So the second part of the workshop or project is the physical purchase banner lending libraries of these banners. So it quickly turned into libraries because many of the people that were making the banners with me are my friends, my family, neighbors, right? Many who are non-citizens and some who are undocumented immigrants who fear going to protest and don't feel safe in those spaces. So in this way, we were making banners because we couldn't take them out ourselves. So I turned the project into a lending library of these banners where those who feel unsafe going to protest can donate their banners to this library where others can check out to use. So in this way, even if we cannot physically attend a protest, our voices are still heard. And those who check out the banners become an ally to these vulnerable communities. So with the collection of banners, we've done several residencies where we have open hours to the public. So this one was at the Chicago Cultural Center from February to May of 2017. And we, the team at the time was Veronica Casado Hernandez, Ishta Jarap, and Tabitha Ankukis. And we, at the Cultural Center, opened this library up to the public for 24 hours a week for people to come in, make banners, check out, and return banners. And as part of our residency and workshops, we also collect slogans and suggestions for slogans because honestly, this is probably the hardest part of making a banner. And by the end of our residency at the Cultural Center, we had more than 6,000 cards. And this really became our inspirational wall. And I really enjoyed seeing the various conversations develop on this wall. It was sort of like watching a physical Facebook thread, right? The right, this one says, give Trump a chance. No, agreed, double agreed, triple agreed, quadruple agreed, right? And so, a lot of these conversations would develop. And, you know, of course, this was an important place for me, or interaction as well, because like I said, making a banner takes an hour and a half and 2 hours, right? So if you don't have that time to to engage in this project, this was a different way that you could engage. And we saw a lot of people keep coming back, right, to look at how the wall would develop. And then if there was any sort of comments made on their card, right? It was interesting also because the residency at the Chicago Cultural Center took place during a time where there were just multiple protests happening every week. And, you know, with it being so in such a central location, it really became close to a lot of the protests, right? So it really became a hub for people to meet and make and check out banners before and after going to protests. So here's an example of a group that came to make banners before heading to DC for the Native Nations Rise March in March of 2017. So once people make their banners, they always have the option to take it or donate it to the project. And I always stress that use is of most importance. So if you're going to use it, take it. If not, consider donating it to the library for other people to use. And we often have people make banners, use them, and then donate them afterwards to the library. So fabric banners have some advantages to paper or cardboard posters. So fabric banners are generally easy to transport, right? So you could just fold it up and throw it in your bag. Many people hold them, they put them on dowels, wear them as capes or aprons, or here you can see even draped onto cars. The second advantage of these fabric banners is that they generally last longer than posters and can be reused many times. In this way, it speaks to time, right? It may be a little pessimistic, but we're going to be fighting these things for a long time. So we estimate that around 3,000 banners have been made in our workshops, nationally and internationally. And there are more than 600 banners collectively in the different Purchase Banner lending libraries in cities all over the US and beyond. And they're constantly being checked out and used. And when someone does check the banners out, we just take down their email address and then ask them to use the hashtag Purchase Banner Lending Library. And we say, please return it once you're done using it so that others can check out to use them as well. And when they get returned, we ask people where they've been taken and used. And so this is Free Street Theater, and they borrow banners for their youth production. They get checked out for protests, marches, political actions, but also conferences, public talks, presentations, performances, retreats, exhibitions, schools, classrooms, fundraiser events, parties. And sometimes people just tell me that I just wanted to put it up in my room. There's no time frame for people to return the banners, and there's no, late fees or any of that, right? So some banners never come back, some come back damaged, and that's all okay and really all part of protests as well. It's also been really interesting to look through media coverage of the protests and marches that happen nationwide and how often I find these banners in the photographs, right? So this is, there were a lot of photos in the news that got shared widely from this event called Home is Here, which was a march to defend DACA and TPS in October and November 2019 that was organized by a coalition of immigrant rights organizations. And so Hana Center Nakasak took about a handful of these banners and carried them through the entire march. And yeah, like I said, there were a lot of photographs taken that we kept finding in media. And this is important for me to think about the visual impact of the banners, as well as, people, I like that people are encountering these artworks in public spaces, right? On the streets and on the pages of newspapers, and of course, shared widely on social media. The words in these banners have a growing history. They are made by someone, used in a protest, returned to the library, and then taken by someone else to a different protest. The banner carries the histories of the hands that made them, hold them, and the places where they have traveled. So as I mentioned before, I only recently became a naturalized citizen. So in 2016, even though I lived in the United States for more than 24 years, I wasn't able to vote. So during these presidential elections, Yeah, particularly in 2016, if you remember, so much that was at stake circled around immigration policy. I really wanted to be able to vote, to have a say in what so greatly impact the safety of my family, friends, neighbors, my community, and myself. So I started to question who can't legally vote in the United States. And I use that word disenfranchised, right? Meaning deprived of the right to vote. So it was really interesting, actually, because this data was actually really difficult to find and continues to be difficult to find. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And yeah, it isn't really common knowledge of that so many people can't legally vote, right? And so this is the categories of people who can't legally vote, from sort of largest category to smallest, right? So youth under 18 are the largest category of people who can't vote, non-citizens after that. Then incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, depending on state. So this is where it gets messy pretty quickly. So in 2020, the Sentencing Project, which is a really amazing resource, estimated that 5.2 million people could not legally vote due to these laws. So if we look at the different states, right? So if you're incarcerated in Maine or Vermont, you can legally, you can vote. Incarcerated people can vote via mail. In 18 different states, incarcerated people lose their right to vote when in prison, but once they're out, they are able to vote again. You see that 3 states are prison parole, then 17 is in parole probation. And then in 11 states, the laws are much stricter. And in some of these states, you lose your right to vote forever. So example, in Kentucky, the governor is the only one who could restore your voting right. And they have to complete an application, and it's up to the governor to accept or deny that application. Virginia as well, if you're convicted of a felony, you automatically lose your civil rights, the right to vote, serve on a jury, run for office, become a public notary figure, and carry a firearm. And the Constitution of Virginia gives the governor the sole discretion to restore voting, to restore civil rights, not including firearm rights, right? And these laws are constantly changing. The 4th category are residents of U.S. territories. Oh, quickly, right? So felony disenfranchisement policies disproportionately impact communities of color, particularly Black and Brown communities. As I said, the 4th largest category are residents of U.S. territories. So people born in Guam, the Virgin Islands, the Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, and Puerto Rico are all Americans. They vote in U.S. congressional elections and presidential primaries, but American-borns in these territories cannot vote for president, not unless they move to the continent, right? Except for the American Samoans, who are not U.S. citizens. They are U.S. nationals. And then the 5th category are those without specific IDs, right? Depending on your state. So if your state requires a certain type of ID and you don't have that ID, then you're disenfranchised, right? And then the 6th category is, as of 2016, the Constitution of 9 states automatically ban anyone declared mentally incompetent, right? Including those under guardianship from voting. So these states are Alabama, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Missouri, South Carolina, South Dakota, Utah, and Virginia, with some exceptions. So the only clear number that I was able to find was this data from the US Election Project, which estimated that 28.6% of the population was ineligible to vote in 2016. So that's about 92 million people. And from the 92 million, they say that an estimated 32 million adults over 18 cannot legally vote in the United States. We do not have an exact updated number for 2020 or for now because of, like I said, the constant changing of laws. And this list and percentage does not even address voter suppression, right? So Ishita and I created, we were looking for infographics and we couldn't find them, so we created our own. So art is the language of imagination. Art allows us to imagine and present alternate pasts, presents, and futures. Through art, we can see our imaginations come to fruition. I use art in this way to create socially engaged projects that reimagine what civic engagement can look like if it were truly made accessible to all. I create things that I want to see or to be true, like voting for all. So luckily, I connected with the Jane Addams Hull House Museum in Chicago to do the 2016 official unofficial voting station, Voting for All Who Legally Can't. So between September 8th and November 8th of 2016, I collaborated with over 15 artists, activists, and organizations, and we created more than 25 stations all over the US and in Mexico. And each of these voting stations took on different forms. Some were performative, uses pedagogical tools, public interactive artworks, events, guerrilla actions. And it wasn't meant to be a scientific demographic undertaking, but a series of interconnected gestures meant to empower disenfranchised people. So this example is Cecilia Aguilar Castillo and Eric Fernandez Saldaña, and they live in Mexico City. And they did a station in Mexico City, Tijuana, and Acapulco. So it was sort of one of my favorite stations, even though I loved a lot of them and unfortunately can't show you all of the stations that took place. But with this one, you would come and vote for the candidate on the official and unofficial ballots using fake blood, right? And then Cecilia and Eric had these Trump and Hillary like styrofoam heads representing them. And then you could vote against the candidates, right? By stabbing them with syringes, Mexican flags, and screws, right? In Acapulco, they went full on effigies, right? With wooden crosses. And then after you would vote against the candidate, you would come and cut out a bird that says Voto Libre, free vote, right? That artist Marianne Sadowski had printed on this flag. And she also did a station at Plaza de la Raza in Los Angeles. And so this was your voting souvenir afterwards. This photo is of Cecilia. She called me right after the Tijuana station saying that, you know, I was going to mail you all of the votes back, but I'm at the border. So I just decided I'll toss it over the border. So in the spirit of freedom, celebration of difference, and fun, at the Jane Addams Hull House, I created a disco-themed environment because I knew I wanted a space to dance our protests. So on the installation, I collaborated with the artist Lisa Hallar-Bagginson, and DJ Sadie Woods created a 24-hour of playlist of protest songs. And here in this installation, you could see we were sort of doing our own perversion of red, white, and blue, and stars and stripes. And we created this language in the textiles and the language of protest banners. So, you know, this project really led directly into the protest banner lending library. So for those who cannot legally vote, Election Day becomes a day where we're invisible and silent, where we get to watch the rest of the country vote. So on this day, rather than staying silent, we decided to take up as much space as possible and to dance, protest and dance and loud celebration. So on this day, we threw multiple parties and events throughout the station. So this was at MCA Chicago, where I collaborated with Roberto Sifuentes and Sadie Woods, and we created an election viewing project party where we had performances, Trump and Hillary piñatas, and we had a balloon drop in the middle of the museum. So this was the results from 2016, right? So we had more than 4,000 votes, and Clinton won by a landslide with more than half of that. Trump 278, Stein 302, Johnson 147, and there were 1,084 write-ins, and Bernie Sanders was in the lead, and then 113 no votes. So the ballot started out with the phrase "I'm voting here because," and then translated in the 5 most spoken languages of Chicago. And what people wrote down in this part was profoundly moving and continues to move me, right? They range from I'm voting here because I care. I still have hope for democracy. I'm voting here because my father could not vote for most of his life because he was incarcerated. I cannot vote because I am an immigrant and cannot vote anywhere. And on the right, you can see I am voting here because I was given the opportunity, and the vote is for a better world where humanity prevails. So, with the 2020 presidential election, even more felt at stake, including the prospect of rampant voter suppression. So, to expand this project, I created 50 voting kits for the disenfranchised. So, it was a collective kit of objects made by myself and other Chicago-based artists to be distributed and to activate imaginative voting stations in the US and all over the world. So you can see we have the official and unofficial ballot box. Then we have 2 ballots, one for the candidate and then one for issues. Then Ishita Darap, who I collaborate with, and we have a project called Cute Rage Press. We created voting stickers for all, and undocumented projects created wristbands that said if we could vote, we would, right? Because when people get to vote, they get a sticker and a wristband, and it's not just an object, but they're really these symbols of pride, right? And so Aaron Delaney, who's an organizer and artist, and I created a list of actions to expand voting rights. Sadie Woods created another playlist that you could get a USB or a vinyl record. And excitingly, this one, Party is Protest, is all music by protest songs by Chicago musicians. So that was really exciting because we did a bunch of programs with music and hiring Chicago musicians to perform. And Ishta and I created these infographics, as I showed you before, sharing who can't legally vote. William Estrada printed these vote for our future, for our children, for our community, for those who can't, in 8 different languages. Of course, you had a choice of banner that you wanted to use. And so the voting kits for the disenfranchised were primarily set up in community organizations, used in classrooms for students to vote and for them to activate their own voting stations, used alongside voter registration drives activated by artists, and installed at various museums, universities, and colleges. So for example, Mural Arts Philadelphia created this standalone voting station structure in Love Park with student-generated materials that highlighted histories of voting rights suppression and advocacy. And then on election day, they created the signages around Philadelphia polling sites using those posters by William Estrada. So, you know, remembering that Philadelphia was such an important site, it was really exciting to see this. As mentioned, they were used along voter registration and by a lot of immigrant rights organizations, such as this one, Soccer Without Borders in Baltimore. And I was also able to work with Sarah Ross to send official and unofficial ballots into prisons, right, for incarcerated people to be able to vote via mail. And we got a huge response of letters and ballots from that engagement. So for her project, Moto Voto, artist and community organizer, Artist Zoe, drove around with a ballot box attached to the back of her motorcycle and was collecting symbolic votes and distributing information about voter suppression, disenfranchisement, and defunding police in Los Angeles. And we again, Roberto Sifuentes, and I asked students in his border crossers, or actually extreme bodies course this time, 4 years ago was the border crossers class, but and Sophia and Alexis created this quilt using the materials and getting responses from those who were disenfranchised to put onto the quilt, and then they did a sort of walking performance again on election day in downtown Chicago. And due to the pandemic and its attending concerns about accessibility and safety, In the summer, I worked with new media artist John Satram, and we created a virtual iteration of the voting stations called officialunofficial.vote. So on this website, you can follow the link to vote in order to vote in 8 different languages for the presidential candidates. You could write in your own candidates, vote on other people's writing candidates. You could vote on voter rights issues. You could write in your own issues. You could vote on other people's issues. And you could, of course, answer that question, I'm voting here because. And under the section Act, it houses the collaborating artist projects that were created for the kits, with some digitization to fit an online platform, and along with digital tools for anyone to use to promote this collaborative shared project, right? And so in addition, we added more projects onto this website as well. So William Estrada and I worked on tools that educators can use in the classroom to engage students around disenfranchisement. And I was the artist in residence for 2020-2021 at Loyola University. And I taught a course solely around this project, and the students in my course created a project to live on this website. So you could see there's lots of posters, lots of stickers, wheat paste posters and tutorials, zines. There is a voting garment, right? And even a voting swing challenge, right? So what can voting look like if it were more accessible? What can voting look like if the disenfranchised could be the ones to determine what shows up on the ballot? The official and unofficial voting station, in all of its activation, creates sites of empowerment, sites for protest, sites for sharing resources, sites for social engagement and discussion. It's a collective art project making disenfranchisement visible and fighting against it in the United States. So coming back to my point about imagination is that it leads to action. At its best, art can push against structures of capitalism, white supremacy, and power to imagine and create new worlds. Once we see these worlds, it's up to us to make them a part of our everyday. Imagination and dreams are the inspiration for action. We demand change because we see and feel different and better worlds. Imagination is what gives us hope. The seeds for action are indignation with the ways things are and imagination for the ways things can be. And we live in a society where so many pathways to healing are cut off, corporatized, or just made inaccessible, including art. It is undeniable that art is a pathway to healing, and even if society makes it hard for us to make art in our everyday, we must do so for our well-being. Making art in this moment is more important than ever. So in 2018, I've been thinking more and more about safety and how I could claim protective spaces for immigrants and BIPOC through my work. So I've been putting the Immigrant Legal Resource Center's red card statements onto curtains to respond to this political climate where more and more people of color are under attack by police and ICE. These have lately been installed at entrances and exits of the installation spaces to ward off authorities and to claim protective spaces for myself and my neighbors. And once you go into the space, they're filled with know your rights in different languages to share this knowledge with my neighbors of how to keep themselves safe. You have constitutional rights. Do not open the door if an immigration agent is knocking on the door. Do not answer any questions from the immigration agent. If they try to talk to you, you have the right to remain silent. Do not sign anything without speaking with a lawyer. You have the right to speak with a lawyer. If you are outside your home, ask the agent if you're free to leave. And if they say yes, leave calmly. And even with the know your rights and red card statements, there are risks for people, especially people of color, to use and assert our rights to authorities. There's always a fear of retaliation and excessive force, but what other options do we have? What's here to protect us doesn't protect us. A system cannot protect those it was never designed to protect. So in the installation at Hyde Park Art Center, portals to safety, freedom, and power were installed behind the curtains, and they were made in the Art and Restorative Justice Team Group at Hyde Park Art Center. And we created 3 portals, one for the past, present, and future. And we came together once a week for 5 weeks for us to collectively make these portals. So this is the portal to safety, freedom, and power in the present moment, where we're up against a brick wall. There's only a sliver of safety, power, and freedom available to us. We're trying to get there, but we're under attack. Making this portal together in particular was healing for us to collectively see the dream that we have on the other side of the brick wall. This is our future beach scene, where Black, brown, immigrant, indigenous, queer, trans, non binary beings can be safe and at rest, where we could dance and be connected to the earth, where gems are washed up on the beach, and we are dancing under a gold, lush palm tree that bears crystal fruit, where the skies are so clear during the night and during the day and at night that you can see the planets orbiting by. And my teen collaborators include the Big Dipper in this portal in the sky, there to guide, as it had in history, guiding those enslaved seeking freedom. But when can we get there? Art is integral to an ecosystem fighting for change. Making art is radical. In our collective making, sharing, expressing joy, and creating culture, we declare that we are never, never other. We are here, we are resilient, and we will continue to fight for our basic human rights to create better worlds and just futures. Thank you.